Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I had the privilege of reading Insya Bhanvati's very absorbing biography of her grandfather, and which documents some of what you've seen in this video montage, his extraordinary personal journey from district court to Supreme Court, his intellectual and moral clarity, his enduringly significant judgments on secularism, federalism, and social justice. And on a lighter note, I was delighted to learn of his boyhood passion for cricket, and I'm not sure whether that played any role in the invitation to ask me to give this lecture. But Insya and your family members may wish to know that Justice Ahmadi's obsession with cricket when he was a young boy, to the exclusion of all else, was shared by me and also by the NLS Vice Chancellor Sudhir Krishnaswamy. So it's serendipitous that also figured in your, incidentally, in a very minor way, in your wonderful book on your grandfather. The title of my talk today is, What Would Dr. Ambedkar Have Made of the Republic of India? In this year, 2025, which is where we marked the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution, a document in whose drafting and passing Dr. Ambedkar played such a critical role. My lecture will look at the enduring relevance of Dr. Ambedkar's social and political ideas and how some of his insights and concerns speak directly to where we find ourselves as citizens of the Indian Republic today. But I'm going to begin on a personal note, just with some brief remarks on my individual discovery of Dr. Ambedkar. I was born in 1958, a decade after independence, in what was then the small sub-Himalayan town of Dehradun, in a family of public servants, devoted, as they saw it, to the well-being of the Republic. There were scientists, teachers, social workers, doctors. But at the same time, unconsciously or consciously of a certain caste and class background, born into an upper caste, middle class family. And my family of public servants, my parents and others, took as their moral beacons Gandhi and Nehru. Possibly, actually, Nehru a little more than Gandhi in the case of my own parents. And, there was always a portrait of Nehru at home, which is red rose. And I, like many children, adopted these values and of my parents. And I grew up admiring Gandhi and Nehru, and I'll come back to that. I don't disavow that. I still, as a caveat and a disclaimer, I still admire Gandhi and Nehru. But Ambedkar was not part of my upbringing. It was not part of my upbringing at home. I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on my personal upbringing, except to say it was absolutely, completely secular. So there was, at home, no, people were treated as equal regardless of religion or caste or gender, but unconsciously, of course, there was the heritage of thousands of years of Brahmin privilege. So there was Gandhi and Nehru and little Ambedkar. And that continued through my journey as a college student in Delhi and on to my PhD in Calcutta, which was not influenced by Gandhi and Ambedkar because it's in the realm of environmental history. And not influenced by Gandhi and Nehru, I beg your pardon, because it was on environmental history. Ambedkar was more or less, I kind of knew that he was involved in the drafting of the Constitution, but his extraordinary significance in our history, in our intellectual, political, and moral life was awakened by a seminar I attended in Manipal in the year 1994. Now, 1994 marked the 125th anniversary of Gandhi's birth. And the great Kannada novelist and public intellectual U.R. Ananthamurthy, who then was based in Manipal for a few years, organized a conference on Gandhi's legacy. It was held in the university and on a stage like this, and against a portrait of Gandhi in his loincloth, bare chested, and a staff. You all know that portrait. And there were many distinguished scholars. As I recall, there was Ashish Nandi, Jeet Oberoi, Claude Alvarez, the environmental activist from Goa, whose work some of you might know, and others. And for 2 days, 2.5 days, we talked about Gandhi and his legacy. And, essentially, the conversation was, what would Mahatma Gandhi have made of the Republic of India today? That's really what it was, 1994. And of course, it was interesting, illuminating, enriching. But the last day, Anantamurthy, there may be people here in this audience who remembered Anantamurthy, and there was always an interesting twist in how he planned such things. On the last day, there was one talk in Kannada by a person who was not known to me at that stage and was known to some of the local residents of Manipal and Dakshin Kannada, but not known to the participants from northern and western and eastern India. This was the Kannada writer Devanur Mahadeva. And he gave a talk in Kannada, which was translated by Anantamurthy. And I'm recalling it from 32 years ago. It's still visibly imprinted in my memory. So here was Mahadeva. Mahadeva, writes a very direct and sharp prose, but he has a very gentle, understated style of speaking. So he started speaking the translation, and he said, as I said, this is from memory, I'm relying on Anantamurthy's translation. As I did then, he said, look, we have been here for 3 days, and we've been talking against this portrait of Bapu. And he addressed Gandhi respectfully as Bapu, Gandhiji. Now, let me read out to you a poem written by a Dalit woman. And this poem, he read out the poem and he said, this poem is exalting, celebrating a portrait of Dr. Ambedkar in a suit. Now, what is the meaning of that poem? Now, supposing Ambedkar was like Gandhiji, when you see Gandhiji in this loincloth, what do you say? What tyaga, what sacrifice? An upper caste baniya, son of a divan, prosperous legal practice, gives it up to work with the people. Now, what if Ambedkar is shown in that same loincloth and bare chested? You will say, and allow me to give a Hindi translation because that's the Indian language I know best, आखिर वो तो हरिजन है और क्या पहनेगा? What else will he wear? It's his wearing a suit that is so remarkable, so distinctive, so counterintuitive, so against the grain of what history, culture, tradition, society permits to him. That is why this Dalit woman wrote a poem glorifying, celebrating Dr. Ambedkar in a suit. Now those 10 minutes of Mahadeva opened my mind. And I came back to Bangalore. I just recently moved to Bangalore and started reading about Ambedkar. And it was a wake-up call. And now, if you just, before I come to what I started reading then, after that conference, just reflect on what Mahadeva said. It's not just a contrast between Gandhi and Ambedkar. It's between Ambedkar and every other icon of the freedom struggle. Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore, Subhash Chandra Bose, V.D. Savarkar, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale were all destined from birth and social privilege to be educated abroad, to travel abroad and wear a suit, and they may or may not have discarded it. So, that is really a very important aspect of Ambedkar's journey, which Mahadeva brought to all of us. And I'm sure many others were as struck as me by his remarks. So after that conference, I started reading about and around Ambedkar. And two books in particular that I read 30 years ago made a profound impression on me. The first was Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. The edition I read, it had been published in 1990, it had a short introduction by the novelist Mulk Raj Anand. Now, again, this is quite interesting to the historian of Indian nationalism and Indian social reform. Mulk Raj Anand, back in 1935, wrote a remarkable novel called Untouchable. It's the first social realist novel in English by an Indian describing the horrors of the caste system. He admired Gandhi for Gandhi's own campaign to end untouchability. Yet he ended the novel Untouchable by suggesting Gandhi's methods could not provide a long-term solution, and it was only modernization and scientific progress and the flush toilet that would end the horrors of manual scavenging. Now, he came to Ambedkar much later. Through his experiences, Mulk Raj Anand grew up in a small cantonment town in the Punjab where he observed untouchable behavior. He was from a middle caste himself. So in 1990, he discovers Ambedkar much later. In 1990, he writes an introduction to Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. And then I read Annihilation of Caste. And some of you would have read it. I returned to it over and over again. I recently wrote an introduction to a wonderful new edition of Annihilation of Caste with a very long gloss on it, which is even longer than Ambedkar's tract, by the Hyderabad philosopher Sayyid Saeed, which is a profoundly insightful book. And it's a direct tract. It's a work of scholarship written for citizens. It's a model for every scholar today who wants to write for citizens, not just for your fellow scholars and for whatever it's called, citation index, Google Scholar, whatever it's called. It draws on deep learning, of course, on personal experience, but even more on deep learning. But it's written with a directness and clarity that is truly admirable. And it shows him to be a brilliant thinker and a powerful polemicist, both. Now, again, with your permission, and with my apologies to those of you who knows this text well, some quotes from the Annihilation of Caste. I'm just going to give you two for the moment. Here's the first. I quote, by the way, again, many of you know the background of the Annihilation of Caste. He was invited by a social reform group in the Punjab to give a lecture. And then when he sent the text, they withdrew the invitation. And then he printed it at his own expense. So he's telling these social reformers in the Punjab, kind of slightly left of the Arya Samaj, if I may say, those social reformers. He's telling them, you are Hindu social reformers, trying to reform Hinduism. You must have the courage to tell the Hindus that what is wrong with them is their religion. The religion which has produced in them this notion of the sacredness of caste. The enemy you must grapple with, he's telling the reformers, is not the people who observe caste, but the Shastras which teach this religion of caste. That's my first quote. My second quote from this text, I quote, political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny. Political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny, and a reformer who defies society is much more courageous than a politician who defies government. Now, this is, I think it's fair to say, an implicit reference to Gandhi, who's leading the movement for freedom against British rule. He's defying society too, but he's more frontally defying the state and politicians. And Ambedkar is suggesting it's harder to challenge society than to challenge the state. Now, I have gone back to Annihilation several times. So that's one book that I read then that has stayed. The other book is somewhat different and has a different, but in my view, possibly complementary message to the Annihilation of Caste. It was written 57 years after Annihilation of Caste. This is the late, great D.R. Nagaraj's book, The Flaming Feet, which was first published in 1993 in a small, limited edition by a Bangalore NGO, and later republished with a very detailed, rigorous critical introduction by his student, my esteemed colleague at Kriya University, Dr. Prithvi Datta Chandra Shobi. And it's available, published by Permanent Black, in paperback. And for anyone interested in this subject, it should be mandatory reading. So I read The Flaming Feet in this small, privately printed edition, and it has a brilliant chapter on the Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship and debate, capturing the different paths taken by the two reformers when it comes to the question of the abolition of untouchability. And Ambedkar captures these two paths as Nagaraj characterizes these two paths as self-purification versus self-respect. Self-purification is Gandhi. Hinduism must cleanse itself of the sin of untouchability. Ambedkar is self-respect. Dalits must stand and affirm their rights in the famous slogan that he made popular: educate, agitate, organize. The self-purification of Gandhi sought to make upper castes abandon their arrogance and contempt for those whom the mere accident of birth had consigned to the bottom of the social hierarchy. On the other hand, the self-respect of Ambedkar was aimed at his fellow Dalits, urging them to claim rights of full and equal citizenship in the equal republic. Or, as one might say, one can reconfigure Nagaraj's distinction between self-purification and self-respect as essentially saying Gandhi urged the Savarnas to rid themselves of their superiority complex, whereas Ambedkar urged the Dalits to rid themselves of their inferiority complex. Now, Nagaraj was writing in the 1990s, shortly after the observance of the birth centenary of Dr. Ambedkar, when there was a real surge in Dalit self-respect, consciousness, organization. The Bahujan Samaj Party was about to be formed, and the whole narrative was posing Ambedkar versus Gandhi. And Nagaraj argued, contrary to what was then the emerging narrative, that there is, I quote, a compelling need to achieve a synthesis of the legacies of Ambedkar and Gandhi. In other words, to build a more caring society, one needed both to awaken afresh the upper caste conscience and to consolidate the efforts for Dalit self-respect. Hence, insisted Nagaraj, I quote, Gandhiji and Ambedkar can and should be made complementary to one another. Now, what Mahadeva and Nagaraj alerted me to was the extraordinary significance of Ambedkar's work on behalf of the oppressed. He was the emancipator of the oppressed. But of course, he was also a profound scholar of democracy. And it's to that aspect of his work, a scholar, a student of constitutional democracy, I'm going to turn to that aspect of his work. And I'm going to offer you some quotes from his writings. Some are well known to specialists, but bear revisiting in the light of where we are today. Some are less well known to even to specialists, and I think are as timely and as relevant. So, as I said, we are now in the year of the 75th anniversary of the promulgation of the Constitution, and you will recall in the last week of January 2025, running into what happened later. Every politician of every party, of every generation, of every part of India was falling over themselves to claim Ambedkar and pay obeisance to Ambedkar. Though, of course, one wondered how many of them had read what Ambedkar said about constitutional democracy, and even if they had, how much they had digested. So I'm going to draw your attention in the first part of what I'm going to say about Ambedkar as a theorist of democracy to two remarkable speeches he made in the Constituent Assembly, which are there in the debates. And I said they're known to specialists, and certainly to general readers well versed with our constitutional history, but I think they bear revisiting. The first speech was made on 4th November 1948, while Dr. Ambedkar was presenting the draft constitution to the Assembly. Here, Ambedkar stressed the importance of what he called constitutional morality. I quote, this is Ambedkar in his speech of November 1948, I quote, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. Ambedkar goes on to say, I quote, "It is perfectly possible to pervert the constitution without changing its form." I repeat, it is perfectly possible to pervert the constitution without changing its form by merely changing the form of the administration and to make the administration inconsistent and opposed to the spirit of the constitution. Now, this is Ambedkar in 1948. A quarter of a century later, in the early 1970s, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi did precisely that. She sought to pervert the form of the bureaucracy and the